So last week we started our series on Daniel, and what we're doing over the next several weeks is we're looking at the life of Daniel, and we're looking at ways that Daniel took stands for his faith throughout his life. And if you read the life of Daniel, what you see is that over and over and over, Daniel would take these stands for his faith. He would take these stands at great cost, or at great risk of cost. And so last week we started off and we talked about how Daniel was taken from his home as a young boy, was taken into captivity, was taken into essentially the king's court, where he learned the Chaldean language and customs, and he was taught that to teach his people. And if you were here last week, then you'll remember that the key last week, what we talked about was how sort of the person that was over this group of guys that Daniel was with, how they were feeding them food and wine that was essentially offered to idols. It was a form of idol worship, and how Daniel took the stand and refused to eat this food, but he did it in a way where he submitted to authority as much as he could, but yet he still took the stand, and God provided for him. And so, and that was sort of the running theme last week, was that Daniel did what he could, and then he trusted God with the rest. And so as we go into this week, what we're going to do is we're going to look at another time where Daniel took a stand and where he was faced with this conflict. And a lot of times when we take stands, it can be maybe very bold stands, maybe stands for our faith, where we're experiencing some kind of persecution or some hostility for our faith. Other times, taking a stand may not be quite so dramatic. It may just be where we have conflict with one another. Maybe in our marriage we have a conflict, an argument with our spouse, and we have to work through that, or maybe there are other conflicts at work or whatever, and maybe we have to take a stand for what we think is right in that conflict. And so for me, I tend to be very conflict averse. I would prefer there not be conflict, and I tend to shy away from it if I can help it. Now, generally speaking, at work, I'm very prone to conflict. I don't seem to shy away from it nearly as much. But outside of work, and I don't know why I'm like that, but outside of work, I tend to be much more conflict averse. And so what that means is that I tend to shy away from it. And what I've learned about people is generally what we do is we respond to conflict in one of really three different ways. One, maybe you're like me, and you'd rather not have conflict. And if something kind of shows up, you're like, never mind. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want any part of this. We tend to shy away from it. We tend to not really like it. You may be, however, a little bit different in that maybe you love conflict. You love a good fight. Anybody ever met that person? Not going to ask you to admit it, but are you maybe that person where you just really love a good fight, right? And you like conflict, and so what happens is you can go maybe to that other extreme, where as opposed to avoiding conflict, you find yourself in the middle of conflict a lot. And how this can manifest itself and how it can really work out really negatively is, and I know you've heard this, I'm going to say what's right, I'm going to say what I think, I don't care who it hurts. Anybody ever heard somebody say that? I don't care how. If I say something and it's the truth and it hurts them, that's on them, not me. And, it's kind of like sort of pulling the pin. You toss the grenade and just walk away as the carnage explodes behind you, right? And so those are two extremes with conflict. There's a third way that we can deal with conflict, and this is what I want to zero in on this morning. And what that is where we experience conflict, where we experience some kind of something negative or whatever, and we do it in such a way that we don't shy away from it, we don't run away from it, but we also don't take pleasure in creating damage to the other person. It's this weird place where we manage conflict, we address it, we deal with it, but we do it in such a way that we look at it from the perspective of what's good for everybody. What's good for the other person? How can I navigate this in such a way that maybe I am right, but do it in such a way that it doesn't hurt this person or cause damage to this person? And if we can understand this, if we can get this, then it really will change the way that we deal with people, because suddenly what happens is we can get out of our own ego and we can get out of our own pride and we can go, okay, I don't have to necessarily, defeat the other person in order to get my point across. But also it can, if you're like me, it maybe can give you a little bit more boldness to go, okay, I can manage this conflict. I can address this conflict in a way because because I need to, but I don't necessarily have to worry about becoming sort of this person that I don't really want to be. And there are times though where when we're in conflict, when maybe we're hit with something, and maybe you feel like this. You feel like the kitten walking in front of a line of German shepherds. If you can't read, maybe, I don't know if the words are too small. It says, police dog's final test, self-control. As all of these dogs are looking at this cat. This cat's just kind of boldly walking through right there in front of all of these German shepherds. And so maybe that's you. Maybe sometimes that's what you feel like when you're experiencing conflict. Like it's you against the world, and whatever happens. You can take that down now. And so in Daniel chapter 4, we're going to see a story or see a situation where Daniel deals with this conflict. And so if you got a Bible, go ahead and turn to Daniel chapter 4. And so basically, and I know we went through chapters 2 and 3, or we didn't, but I'll go over that in just a minute. So basically what happens is at this point, King Nebuchadnezzar is the king, and he's not a particularly good guy. And he's been back and forth with the whole God thing. He's not really recognized God. He's kind of recognized God, and he's kind of not. He sort of goes back and forth. And so one night he has this dream, and I'm going to summarize the dream for you. Basically, he has this dream, and there's this really tall tree. It reaches up to the heavens. Birds live in it. It feeds the whole earth. This massive tree. And then he sees this Holy One coming down from heaven. This angel comes from heaven, and the Holy One cuts the tree down and cuts off its branches. The animals leave the tree, but the stump is left with roots in the ground, and a band of iron and bronze are around it. So the tree's cut down, and they basically have capped it with these metal bands. And then the Holy One says things like, let him have the mind of an animal, and let him share plants of the earth with the animals. And so Daniel 4:17 says this. This decision is by the decree of the watchers, and the sentence by the word of the Holy One, is in order that the living may know that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets it over the lowest of men. Now this is part of Nebuchadnezzar's dream, and I wanted to really zero in on this verse, because there's something here, and I want you to pay attention to the second half of that. That the Most High rules in the kingdom of men, gives it to whomever he will, and sets it over the lowest of men. So, what happens is the dream completely freaks out Nebuchadnezzar. He's really troubled by it. He doesn't know what it means. He doesn't know what's going on. And so Daniel is with him, and he tells Daniel the dream. And basically, he then asks Daniel what the dream means. So Daniel is in a place where he has to make a decision. Because Daniel understands the meaning of dreams. That's something that God's gifted him to do. And we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So Daniel, the king looks at Daniel and says, what in the world does this dream mean? Verse 19 says that Daniel is alarmed and he's stunned. And he says something interesting. He says, my Lord, may the dream apply to those who hate you, and its interpretation to your enemies. The problem is the dream's not for those who hate Nebuchadnezzar, and the interpretation's not for his enemies. It's for Nebuchadnezzar. And so here's the thing. Daniel can do one of a couple of different things. He can ignore it. He can sell out. He can just sort of, placate the king. He can say, it means whatever, whatever makes the king feel good about himself. He can avoid the conflict, right? That's one option. For me, that's probably what I would do. Oh man, don't worry, it's great, it's good. You're the tree, but when the tree gets cut down, it's not you, it's all your enemies, and God's going to smite everybody. But you, king, you're crushing it. Or he can tell the king exactly what he thinks. He can interpret the dream, and he can tell and just let the king pick up the pieces. He can also call the king an idiot for not knowing what the dream means. It's a tree. King, what's wrong? Come on. The angel told you you're the tree. He could have done that. Either one of those two things would not have been wise. So Daniel has this problem. Now, hey, Chloe. What you may not know is in chapters 2 and 3, there's a lot of things that leads up to this. And this also is going to affect the way that Daniel sort of approaches this problem. You see in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar has this dream that frightens him. And so he brings all of his sorcerers, his wise men, his astrologers, everybody into the room. And he says, I had this dream, but I need you to tell me what the dream was and what it means. And there's probably a hushed silence, much like there is here this morning. Everybody looking at each other, and they go back and forth. And finally, the astrologers are like, King, nobody can do this. We can't tell you what you dreamed and what it means. Like, you got to give us something to work with here. And Nebuchadnezzar is very angry about this. And so he says, well, I want all of the wise men killed. All the astrologers and whatever. You guys are all useless. And so you're all going to die. Well, in this time, or in this sort of this roundup, he rounds up Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego as well to bring them in to kill them. And so that leads into chapter 3, and there's Daniel in the lions in the fiery furnace, and you know that some of you know that, and so. And my point is to say that earlier on, when Nebuchadnezzar had this dream and nobody knew what it meant, it was going to lead to the death of every dream interpreter. So Daniel is in this place now where he's been told this dream. He has to interpret it. If he doesn't interpret it, he's going to die. If he does interpret it and he's wrong, he's probably going to die. If he interprets it and he's right, he's probably going to die. There's no way this ends well for Daniel because the dream is not really good for Nebuchadnezzar. So Daniel basically, here's what he says. Verse, I think it should be the next slide. Verses 20 through 22 say this. 20. Yeah, let's do 20. There we go. Thank you. The tree that you saw, which grew and became strong, whose height reached to the heavens, and which could be seen by all the earth, whose leaves were lovely, and its fruit abundant, and which was food for all, under which the beasts of the field dwelt, and in whose branches the birds of the heaven had their home. It is you, O king, who have grown and become strong, for your greatness has grown and reaches to the heavens, and your dominion to the end of the earth. And it sounds good, right? Sounds great. I'd love to have a dream where that described me. I know I'm not that guy, but it'd be nice to at least dream that. The dream goes on, or Daniel goes on. And as much as the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from heaven and saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave its stump and roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, and the tender grass of the field, let it be wet with the dew of heaven, and let him graze with the beasts of the field, till 7 times pass over him. And we're going to go on to verse 25. This is the interpretation, O king, and this is the decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king. Next one. Oh, sorry. 25. Did I get them out of order? Sorry, bud. Verse 25. We'll get it. See, no, we don't know what we're doing, right? I warned you guys. You will be driven away from people and will live with the wild animals. You will eat grass like the ox and be drenched with the dew of heaven. 7 times will pass by for you until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth, and gives them to anyone he wishes. This is where the conflict comes in. Because at this point, and basically what Daniel is saying here is you're going to get cut down, you're going to lose your kingdom. Not only are you going to lose your kingdom, but you're going to graze with the wild animals. You're going to lose your mind. Until you acknowledge that the Most High is sovereign over all kingdoms on earth and gives them to anyone he wishes. That's why what I read earlier was so important about that dream. When the angel was telling Nebuchadnezzar, God is the one who's in control, not you. There was a message there. And so Daniel says this. And now we're getting to the meat of the issue here. And really it is that God's not pleased with Nebuchadnezzar's pride. And God is getting ready to take his kingdom away. And so at this point, Daniel really could have quit talking. Daniel could have said, all right, option B, pull the pin, toss the grenade, and just watch the carnage unfold. And so Daniel has done his job. He's said what needed to be said. Verse 26 says, and inasmuch as they gave the command to leave the stump and root of the tree, your kingdom shall be assured to you after you come to know that heaven rules. And so there's some hope there, but Nebuchadnezzar has got to get over his pride. He's got to get over himself. And so basically what Daniel says is, King, your pride is what's going to be your downfall. God is not pleased with it. You're going to lose your kingdom. You're going to go mad. You're going to eat grass. You're going to graze around like an ox. And it says the 7 times pass, and basically that means for 7 years you're going to be completely out of pocket until you acknowledge God and until you acknowledge God's authority. And then your kingdom will be given back to you after you come to know that heaven rules. And Daniel, again, could have stopped. He could have just thrown a grenade and just walked away. He interpreted the dream. He gave the bad news. And at least at this point, he's not dead yet. And I wonder if he's waiting for death to come. Because he's just told the king, who was notorious for killing people. Now, I want you to understand this. This was not a good guy. He was a bad guy. And Daniel has time and time again taken these stands before the king. And it's worked out for him. And at some point, I wonder, and this is pure speculation, but I kind of wonder if maybe even Daniel is waiting for his luck to run out. But here's the kicker. And this is the thing. Verse 27 says this. King Nebuchadnezzar, please, this is Daniel talking to him, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what is right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. Now, I want you to understand how radical this is. Because Daniel is talking to the king who's pulled him away from his family, who's taken his people into captivity, who's trained him to basically brainwash his people, who has over and over and over again, done these things. Daniel's taken the stand, and it's caused Daniel. It got him thrown in the furnace. It got him, it got him put in jail because he wouldn't worship the statue that Nebuchadnezzar had. It has him fearing for his life if he tells the king the wrong thing. And in spite of all of this, he says, please accept my advice. Stop sinning and do what is right. Break from your wicked past and be merciful to the poor. Perhaps then you will continue to prosper. I wonder why he would say that. I think the reason why he says that is because he's concerned with Nebuchadnezzar's relationship with God. And we should be concerned with others' relationship with God. That should be something that concerns us. And especially when we're dealing with conflict and we're taking these stands, that should be in our mind. What is this person's relationship with God? If they don't have a relationship with God, how can I manage this? How can I navigate this conflict in such a way that maybe there's an opportunity for this person to come to a relationship with God? What it means is I have to get past myself and I have to bite my tongue and I have to get out of my own mind and get rid of my ego to the point to where I can manage the conflict in such a way that I don't look like the kind of guy that doesn't care about the person. Because what I've learned most of the time when there's conflict, and I've seen this over and over and over as I've arrested people, most of the time, even in something like that, if I listen to them, 9 times out of 10, they'll go with me willingly. I've had to wrestle a couple of people, but not many. Because most people, if I'm in that situation, if I can at least give them a chance to talk and I can listen, most of the time they're going, okay, cool. And what that does for me is that it gives me an opportunity then to continue to be an influence on them as opposed to just going, you shouldn't have done this, and slam them and do all kinds of stuff. But we should be concerned with others' relationship with God. We should be concerned with the good of others. I've got a friend who's really struggling right now with issues of faith. He can't really reconcile things that happen, some of the things that happen in the Old Testament with Jesus, and some of you, you may have struggled with that. You may know people who struggle with that. The Old Testament, and the New Testament, and how they look different, and how God did things, and he just can't quite get over some of the things in the Old Testament. And he asks me questions time and time again. Well, what about this and what about that? And he's saved. I know he knows. He's got a relationship with Jesus, but he's really struggling. And he asks me these questions, and I'm answering them the best that I can. But my heart breaks because I want him to have a relationship with Jesus that's freeing and this good, and not something that he has to white knuckle or really just have this tension, but to really live in freedom in his relationship with Christ. And every conversation that I have with him, it's because I'm concerned for his relationship with God. I could win an argument. We could get into debates, but I want him to love God, and I want him to have a relationship with God. And so many times, I think if we can get out of our own ego and get out of our own space and think about the other person and go, I'm concerned about this person's good. I'm concerned about this person's relationship with God, if they're a believer, if they're, even if they're not. And Daniel's concern was for the king. And his concern was for the king's relationship with God. And he says, King, stop sinning. Stop doing what you're doing. Turn from iniquity. Don't do these things. Show mercy to the poor. Do what God wants you to do, and perhaps you'll continue to reign. What a crazy thing for Daniel to say to Nebuchadnezzar. Perhaps you'll continue to reign. You would think if it were me, I would have been like, whatever we can do to get you off the throne, bless God, let's get you out of here. But Daniel's concern was for Nebuchadnezzar's good, as counterintuitive as that is. In verses 29 and 30, and this is not in there, but I want to read this to you. It says, the king spoke, saying, so Daniel says this, and then at the end of 12 months, I missed a part there. At the end of 12 months, he's walking about the royal palace of Babylon. So Nebuchadnezzar has had a year from when Daniel told him this until when the prophecy it begins to be fulfilled. So for a year, he's had opportunities to turn back to God, or to turn back to God. He's had a year to do these things. And verse 28, all this came upon King Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of the 12 months, he was walking about the royal palace of Babylon. Then the king spoke, saying, Is not this great Babylon that I have built for a royal dwelling by my mighty power and for the honor of my majesty? So Daniel tells him this. Daniel shows this concern. Daniel takes this stand that could kill him. And for a year, we've been waiting. For a year, there's been nothing. Nebuchadnezzar has continued on, and even at the end of a year, Nebuchadnezzar is still completely eaten up with his pride. And at the end of that, at that point, he's driven out of his kingdom. He's driven mad. I want to read you something that's interesting. According to Dave Guzik, who writes the Enduring Word Commentary, he writes, there's no corresponding record of this 7 times period of insanity in the secular records of Babylon, exactly as we would expect, considering the customs of that time. Nevertheless, Abdinus, a Greek historian, wrote in 268 BC that Nebuchadnezzar was possessed by some god and that he had immediately disappeared. He goes on to write, some dismiss the account of Nebuchadnezzar's madness as unhistorical, but there is no historical record of his governmental activity between 582 BC and 575 BC. This silence is deafening, especially when we keep in mind how Near Eastern leaders like to egotistically trumpet their achievements and hide their embarrassments. So I believe Nebuchadnezzar was driven mad because God's word says that Nebuchadnezzar was driven mad. He roamed around like an ox. He ate grass. Daniel says that he grew his hair out where it looked like eagle's feathers, and his fingernails grew out where they looked like the claws of eagles. And he was a madman for 7 years. And so, again, when we don't, we don't, there's not historical evidence of that. But what's interesting, again, is there is a 7-year gap in sort of the records of King Nebuchadnezzar, when at that time, history was written by the winners, right? Isn't that what they say? History is written by the winners. And so these kings, they would inflate themselves. They would inflate everything about themselves. And so it's very strange that Nebuchadnezzar, as proud as he was, would have 7 years of nothing. And it's because for 7 years, Nebuchadnezzar was driven mad, as God told him that he would be in the dream. And so after a long time, verse 34, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. Then I praised the Most High. I honored and glorified him who lives forever. And here's the thing about God. God really is the great restorer. Because as bad as Nebuchadnezzar was, and as many times as Nebuchadnezzar messed up, and he would worship God, and then he'd worship himself, and he'd worship God, and then he'd worship himself, and he went back and forth, most likely because of Daniel's influence in the kingdom. It was Daniel's influence that was most likely influencing Nebuchadnezzar to worship God in any sort of circumstance. But in spite of all of that, and in spite of 7 years of madness, God still restored Nebuchadnezzar once he recognized God's authority. Because God told him that he would restore him when he understood that heaven ruled, when he understood that it wasn't about him. And so Nebuchadnezzar's pride and this dream led him to this point to where for 7 years he's wandering around like a madman, and then he's restored. And I think when it comes to conflict and it comes to taking a stand, there are times where we have to stand and we have to just do what we have to do. But those times are relatively few. Generally speaking, when we experience conflict and when we have to sort of take these stands, most of the time there's a way that we can do so where we can be concerned about the other person, where we can navigate this thinking about them and ultimately trusting that God is the great restorer, that God is going to restore whatever it is that's going on. Whether it's our marriage, that maybe for years we've, just been, drifted apart and it's tense and there's a struggle. God can restore that. If it's a family relationship, God can restore that. God wants to restore those things, ultimately restore us to Him and for His glory. And I think so many times what we do is we get so caught up in sort of taking the stand and being right that we forget about that. And here's the thing, and this is the goal, is that we confront with love and always with the goal of restoring the person to God. And if we can think about that and we can keep that in our mind when we experience conflict, no matter who it is, if we can remember that, then what that does is that gets us back in that sort of, in that rare place in the middle there where we're not running away from conflict. We deal with conflict, but we're not just like a bull in a china shop and just going, I'm going to say whatever I have to say and I don't care what it is, because somewhere in the middle of that, generally speaking, and again, there are exceptions for everything, and I'll acknowledge that, but generally speaking, there are ways where we can navigate conflict, where we can deal with conflict, where we can take stands in such a way that we can pray that God will be honored, and we can do that with the hope of restoring them to God, or at least leaving an opportunity for that to happen. And I'm convinced that this is what motivated Daniel over and over and over again. And there are times where Daniel took stands and it did cost him. We saw last week where Daniel took the stand and God delivered him. God delivers Daniel over and over and over. There's pain, there's consequence, there are things that happen. But we see after all of these things, we're going to continue to see this through the book of Daniel, that Daniel developed, Daniel genuinely had this affection for the king and wanted the best for the king. And he knew that what was best for the king was for his heart to be set on God, for the king to follow God. If the king was honoring God, then things are going to work out for the king. And not only would things work out for the king, but things would work out for the people of God that the king had in captivity. One of the things that I read about several years ago, and I'm sure that it's even more the case now, and some of you know this, that there is a huge revival that's sweeping China. And the more the Chinese government tries to stamp out the church, the more the church grows. And every time they bulldoze a church, 2 or 3 home churches pop up. And it's just, the gospel just can't be contained and it can't be eradicated. And the Chinese government, this is what's happening, is work conditions in China are slowly starting to get better over the country. Because what's happening is factory workers or factory owners, business owners are beginning to get saved. And when they get saved, they begin to realize that they have to treat their people better because they're Christians. And Jesus wants them to treat, Jesus wants us to love people. And so slowly what's happening is these working conditions in factories across the country are slowly getting better because the business or the factory owners fall in love with Jesus, and that affects the way that they treat the people that are under them. And if we can get Nebuchadnezzar's heart on God, then that's going to affect the way that Nebuchadnezzar treats other people. If you and I can focus the people that we're dealing with, if we can witness to them, if we can give them a glimpse of Jesus and a glimpse of the gospel, then there's hope that we can affect the way that they treat not only us, but they treat other people, because their lives will be changed with the gospel. But we have to be willing to take that stand. We have to be willing to navigate that conflict, but in such a way that we do it with love, and we do it with a way that ultimately we hope restores the person. And I'm not great at this. I'm getting better, I hope, I think, when I can remember to think about this. But it's almost like a habit. It's almost like muscle memory. But ultimately, again, I think that's what honors God is when we navigate conflict, when we take stands, and we keep these things in mind. Because again, God is the great restorer. Maybe you're here this morning, and maybe you're in the middle of conflict. Maybe something in your family, maybe something in your marriage, maybe something. Maybe this morning you've just been frustrated. If you're like me, you've probably blown it a bunch. Stuck your foot in your mouth, said something hurtful just to say something hurtful. Done that a lot. Sometimes I'll try to end an argument like that. I'll be in an argument. I'll just keep going and going and going, and I'll finally just say the most hurtful thing I can say just to get the argument to end. What a terrible thing to do. That's pulling the pin and throwing the grenade. But maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you just need some time as we're in this invitation to just go, God, help me to navigate this conflict. God, help me, whatever the stand is that I have to take, help me to do this. Help me to love the person that I'm in conflict with. And sometimes that's hard to do. God, help me to do this. Maybe you're here this morning and you're going, well, I don't really know. I don't know about any of that. And it's maybe because you don't have a relationship with Jesus. Maybe this morning you would be willing to say, Jesus, help me to live like you. Help me to be like you, God. I want to ask you to forgive me of my sins and cleanse me and help me to follow you. Help me to live like you. And I think if we do that, I know that God will come into Jesus will save us and he'll give us new life. And then we have the power of the Holy Spirit to help us to do this, to help us to look at conflict in such a way that we can restore people and not destroy them. Stephen's going to come up and play. And what we're going to do this morning is the same thing we've done for the last several weeks. I was going to give you 3 or 4 minutes to pray. And maybe you just need to take some time and just ask God to help you with whatever's going on sort of in your life. Maybe, again, you need to be saved this morning. And I'd love to talk with you about that and to help you. But ultimately, you can be saved right where you are. It really is just a position of your heart to say, God, I'm a sinner and I need your forgiveness. Help me to live like you. Help me to ask you to be the Lord of my life. I'm getting tongue-tied here. And help me to follow you. And Jesus can save you right where you are. He can change your heart right where you are. Whatever it is that God's calling you to do this morning, I pray that we would honor him and do that. So I'm going to pray. We're going to start us off, and then in just a few minutes I'll close this and then we'll be dismissed. Let's pray together. God.